In reality, it's probably going to be more of a monthly thing. We're going to adjust the schedule when we have topics. And the goal for this is just to be on the same page so everyone knows different security terms, security techniques, and you'll see some of them are going to be more useful to like an engineering person. Others will be more useful to a product person, for example. So today we're going to talk about the cyber defense matrix. So it's definitely not a technical topic on the surface. I think it's going to be very useful for people who work in product, marketing, anything related to growth. And then everyone else, I think it's useful just so we have common terms and understanding for this. So keep in mind, this is recorded. This is supposedly going to go to YouTube. I think it will. And make sure you interrupt me and ask as many questions as you can. And I'm going to have a lot of questions for you as well. So thanks for taking the time to join, because I can't just record these on my own. So first, we're just going to talk about what the cyber defense matrix is, and then we're going to look at it in more detail. So it's abbreviated as the CDM, right? Because we need more acronyms in security, right? So it's a framework to just make it easier to talk about security. And that can sound very obvious, but there's probably thousands of security companies out there. And there's hundreds of different types of products. And because a lot of the marketing around it is so hyped, for example, everyone sells a solution that they call zero trust, right? Do we even know what zero trust means anymore, right? Like, what does it help me actually do, right? So the cyber defense matrix was created by Sunil Yu when he worked at the Bank of America. I think it was like 2015 or 16, because he was in charge of all like evaluating security startups and security innovation. And he just realized like, there's no way we can even understand what all these companies do. But then it has a lot more use cases. So essentially, we just need a common language, right? There's too many buzzwords and acronyms, and this will help us, explain things in a way that everyone can understand and make sure we're on the same page. And when I say there's too many acronyms, there's too many buzzwords, right? Like CWPP, CSPM, NGFW. Like, did anyone know all three of these before seeing them? Did anyone know one of them? Maybe Next Gen Firewall?
No.
And all right, and even Next Gen Firewall, I think is the funniest one, because at this point it's probably like 10 years old, right? And so there's a whole category of products in security called Next Gen Firewalls, and it's been so for the last 10 years. And how does it make sense to call it? Like, to me, they're current gen firewalls, right? But the industry keeps creating these new terms and new categories. So what happened then with Next Gen Firewall specifically was, I think it was Palo Alto Networks introduced some new firewalls that had some features to identify like the apps people were using, right? So it was acting on the users and the apps and not just at the network level. And so they kind of convinced analysts to come up with this new category, I assume. But this new category came out at the same time as their stuff did. But now every firewall out there is a next-gen firewall. So what does it do, right? So it's super confusing. And the cloud space also made that even more confusing, because just like cloud in itself, right? When we're talking about cloud, are we talking about the cloud APIs and the console? Are we talking about VMs running in the cloud? Are we talking about containers? Are we talking about functions? It's super confusing. So this is the matrix, right? It's super simple. It's got a lot of depth when you start digging into it, but it's really easy to get started, right? So if you see the columns right here, you've got 5 functions. So these are the things that we do in security, right? You identify the things that you have, right? Like, okay, we've got some laptops, we've got some user data, customer data. You want to protect it. You want to detect when something goes wrong. And once you've detected that, you want to respond to the incident, and then you may need to recover from it. So for example, if you do not detect anything, you don't respond, and that was ransomware and all of your data is gone, your recovery step might be restoring from backup, or it could even be like paying a ransom and hoping everything's going to turn out for the best. And these functions are taken from the NIST cybersecurity framework. So if you ever hear like NIST CSF, That's a framework that was created by NIST in the US, originally for utilities, right? Like power companies and so on. And the whole framework, like, I don't think you should go out and necessarily go and read it, but it had these functions. And I think it makes talking about security pretty easy, especially with like board members, right? Like if you were a chief security officer in a utility, and you keep using these 5 terms, at some point, like your board and your CEO will understand, what we're talking about, versus if you always use like industry lingo. And if you look at the bottom, you see this scale of like people, technology, and process. And this is just to indicate that on the left, people are required less and technology is required more. And then it's the opposite on the other end, right? So what that means is you can probably have a really good inventory of systems, especially if you're using the cloud, without any human intervention. However, if your entire company gets wiped and you need to restore from backups, you're going to need a lot of people to help with that, because you won't be able to automate all of it, right? So as we move from left to right, there's more and more manual effort that's required. And yeah, so that's what I just explained about the NIST CSF function. So identify is really about your inventory, your discovery. Protection is about access controls, enforcing secure configurations, for example. Detect would be anomaly detection or continuous monitoring. Respond could be mitigating an incident, doing your actual incident response process to understand everything that happened. And then recovery of services, your communications with customers would fall in recovery. But one thing that's not shown in the cyber defense matrix is there should be a line here, right, between protect and detect. And they use a lot of military terms for these types of frameworks. And so they call it left of the boom and right of the boom, right? And the boom is something went wrong, right? So you can identify your systems all day long and you can protect them all day long, but if nothing ever went wrong, you would never detect anything, right? Like there's never any malware, there's never any attempted or successful attack, then there's nothing to detect, right? So keep that in mind when trying to see what fits where, right? If nothing goes wrong, then you cannot respond to something going wrong. Then on the left, we have the things we can automate a lot, as I was saying, and on the right, we have more manual effort. So that's for the columns. Then if we look at the rows, these are the things that we care about, right? So devices, applications, networks, data, and users. I should actually not have put my box around degree of dependency here. Okay, so let's try it out. There's a few trick questions in there, but not all of them. So can someone tell me where they think a laptop would fit in these rows? Noah, where do you think a laptop fits?
Devices.
Oh, all right, Nathan. Yeah, devices. You're totally right. So the laptop is a device. That's an easy one. It's very obvious. What about the firewall?
Networks
Yeah.
or data.
So that's where it starts being a little bit more complicated, right? Your firewall itself is definitely a device, right? So if you bought a tool that helps you do inventory management of firewalls, that tool would definitely fit under devices identified, right? Because you're trying to inventory everything you have in your company. But if you're using your firewall to protect, you're probably using your firewall to protect a network, right? So it would fit right under that box in network protect. So that's where you see that the thing itself might be used for a use case, in this case, protect networks. However, you might see it appear in other areas if you're trying to inventory that specific device. What about Google Chrome? Charlie, where do you think Google Chrome fits?
I feel like it would be an application.
Okay, all right, perfect. That's the other thing that's not clear when you start using the cyber defense matrix. And it is that when we talk about applications in this context, and I didn't tell you before, right? So I was totally expecting you to say applications, but when we talk about applications in this context, these are the applications that, like applications that we make or that someone would make custom for us. So for example, at Fleet, like Fleet would fit under applications. Google Chrome, I would put under devices, right? Because it's an off-the-shelf tool that we all have on our laptops. And the main difference is an application like Fleet, you would protect very differently than an application on a laptop, right? The application on your laptop, you mostly make sure that it's configured properly and that it is up to date. And you do that with tools that usually impact the device itself and not the application. Whereas a web application, you might protect with a web application firewall, you might protect with denial of service protection. So that's the other trick, right? So when you see applications, then like Fleet is the application for our company. And the things that are just installed on our laptops, they usually fit on their devices.
Got it. And what about from the perspective of like a Fleet user or customer? Would that change where it gets placed?
Yeah. So if they buy Fleet and then they deploy it, right, it's not just like one application you put on one device, right? Like it's a thing that you deploy on different servers. So even though it's not made custom for them, it's a more complicated web application with multiple tiers. Like it's got a database, it's got a back end, it's got a front end. Then they could totally protect it with a web application firewall, which would fall under protect applications. But the agent itself then would fit under devices, right? Like if you're using Orbit, for example, to deploy OS query, that would fit under devices. Now, what Fleet lets you do, I think, is very clearly the devices identifier, right? Because we help people identify what's going on their systems, right? Like what software is installed, what users are logged in, what SSH keys are there. It also helps us identify vulnerabilities on systems, right? So if you had to tell a customer where Fleet fits in the cyber defense matrix, I would say it fits under devices identify. And then we're stretching a little bit towards protect with the policies. But the reason I would still say identify is because you can set a policy to warn you if a laptop is not encrypted. But Fleet is not going to go and encrypt that laptop, right? So it's not really protect, right? Like it's enabling you to protect. But when we say enabling you to protect, that means we're helping you identify what needs to change. So Fleet fits right here. But if you were talking to a security engineer saying, I want to put some additional security around my Fleet deployment, then we would tell them, okay, Fleet is an application, and then you need to look at tools that you would use to secure web apps, right? So that covers Fleet. And then if we have someone like Mike McNeil, well, he's definitely a user, right? And so the technologies to protect users are very different than what you do to protect the devices. And I say technologies, it doesn't necessarily need to be tech, right? For example, identify users, that would be like your directory, right? Like we use Google, we have a directory in Google that's totally identify users. But if I wanted to identify who is more susceptible to phishing, then we could do phishing testing. And at that point, I'm identifying vulnerabilities in users, right? I'm doing the same thing Fleet does for laptops, which is tell me that this version of Java is vulnerable. But I would say, okay, this person clicks on more phishing links, right? I've identified a vulnerability there, and maybe they need some additional training, or we need to change some policies to make it so they don't make those mistakes. So let's try it out with either like products that you know of, or product categories if you don't want to name a specific vendor, and let's see where it fits. So does anyone have an example of a vendor or a product that you would like to map?
Coinbase.
Well, it's got to be a security. It's got to be a security product,
sure,
right?
Sure.
That being said, Coinbase probably fits in some places. Like they probably have a lot of tools around protecting users, right? Probably like two-factor authentication and different things like that. The blockchain, we could say, is a way of making sure the data is protected from deletion, right? But that's the thing, right? Like that's almost a platform, and it's not a security product. So we would have to, slice it into different things before we did that.
I'll try a different one then. How about YubiKey or YubiKeys?
All right. So hardware security keys. What do they let you do, right? You get the security key. Let's say it's a YubiKey, right? So I got one right here. it lets me do a few things, right? Lets me do two-factor authentication when I log into things like Facebook, Google, Twitter, GitHub, different things like that. It lets me store encryption keys, right? So I can sign my commits. Is there anything else hardware security does? I think that's pretty much it, right? Like it can store, if it's a YubiKey, it can store encryption keys, and all security keys then allow you to do two-factor authentication. So where do you think that would fit?
I honestly don't know, but my initial guess would either probably be devices or users.
So,
but I might just not be understanding the categories as well as I should.
right. So it depends on what you use it for, right? So you actually identified a really good thing here. If we were using two-factor authentication to log into like your laptop, then you're actually protecting the device. But typically with two-factor authentication, two-factor authentication on devices is definitely coming. It's more and more common. But where we see application two-factor being used is usually to secure applications, right? And so you could say that two-factor authentication is helping you protect your applications, but in reality, what you're really protecting is the user accounts, right? Like you're protecting the users from getting phished. So I think I could definitely see an argument for both protect applications and protect users. And then what you're going to see is vendors and products will typically expand one way or the other. And yeah, thanks, Rachel, for putting fleet right there. So you could have a vendor making a tool that is really good for detecting laptops, right? To detect your laptop inventory. And then they'll add a feature to do inventory of applications and networks and maybe eventually data, right? So you could see a vendor going like horizontally like that, but you also see vendors going vertically, and you also see vendors going horizontally where they start by letting you understand what's going on and then improve the security of it by protecting and then adding on some detection features. But what you will see is that there's actually very few vendors and tools in the recover space, right? I don't know if anyone can think of a lot of recover tools except for backups, right? So data recover is backups. I guess you could say for devices, automation for deploying systems could be considered recovery as well. But there's very few tools on the right, and there's a lot of them on the left, and that fits in with that concept of there's more technology on the left. That being said, for two-factor, I think we could actually dig into it a little bit more, maybe after the call, because there's a lot of depth into that example. But if I had to pick one, I would say it's users more than applications. And I try to put things in a single rectangle. So most of the times you'll see a vendor fit in one box or multiple boxes that touch each other. It's not 100% the case, because sometimes you're going to look at a product like that's almost more like a platform, right? If you're looking at Microsoft Office 365 Enterprise Security E5, these big products that have a million different features, they might cover a few different boxes. So Rachel, can you remove your 2FA/YubiKey from applications, right? So it makes more sense to have it under users because we're really protecting the user account. We're making sure the user account is not getting abused. Does anyone have another example for identify? And it doesn't have to be identify devices because we've got feed there. Does anyone have an example there? I have one example that I know fits under identify. So Rumble. I don't know if many of you know Rumble. I know some of you do. So Rumble is a security product. I think their URL is rumble.run, cool domain. And it's a network discovery tool, right? But what does a network discovery tool do is it scans your network. And so your first your first guess might be, okay, that's identify network, but why do you scan the network? Well, it's because you want to find devices, right? Like you want to find, like, do I have IoT devices? Do I have cameras? Do I have medical systems on my network over there? So it definitely helps you identify devices. But where it does also identify networks is because it lets you discover networks that you didn't even know you had. So for example, when you set up something like Rumble, you'll say scan these IP addresses, and it'll scan all of them. But then it might tell you, hey, by scanning this, we found a server, and this server had like 3 different network cards on it, and 2 of them were connected to networks that you don't have in your configuration. So it helped you discover an application and a network and a device, right? Because it might say like, oh, this web app is running on this other interface on this other network. So if you had to draw a Rumble, you could draw a rectangle that goes from devices identify to networks identify. So Rachel, I don't know if you want to update your little drawing there. Thanks a lot. So you can draw a square and put Rumble in it, and then maybe move Fleet to the side. So that's pretty obvious one. Once you know it, right? The network part is not obvious at all until you understand that the tool is there to discover devices and applications. Does it discover networks as well? Yes, it does. So it fits in there.
Yeah. Sorry.
Yes.
Could you apply that same logic going back to the 2-factor? You're protecting users, but then aren't you ultimately protecting data as well?
Well, so the data is really behind everything in, I was going to say security, but like in tech, right? Like, why do we have an app? Like, there's data behind it. But when we talk about protecting the data, like we try to take that at like the more atomic level of like, what would protect data? Encrypting it, for example, would protect it, and making sure that the access controls to the data protect the data. If I have data that is like super well encrypted, the keys are super well managed, right? And you're like, oh, my data is rock solid. But then, someone's password is password 1 and there's no 2-factor authentication. You can still log into the application and retrieve that data. That data was compromised, not necessarily because the data itself was not protected properly, but it's because the user accounts were not protected well. And so these access controls, they become useless, right? And so that's why a lot of the security controls around data, they're really good at protecting like entire database leaks, right? Like you encrypt your database and then you back it up. If someone gets into your backups, it's encrypted, you're safe. But if someone breaks into your web app that has the keys to read the data and does like an SQL injection, for example, then it's not that useful. So we have to take it to kind of a atomic level. Then we talked about recover. That's really around backups usually, or anything that will really help you, rebuild things, or even I would say communications we could fit in there, though that would be kind of a weird one to try to map. Another example I'd like to try is different types of vulnerability scanning tools. So then, does anyone have examples of security scanning tools? There's Fleet, obviously, right? And we said Fleet is devices identify. We identify vulnerabilities that installed software have on machines running Fleet, right? Then there's tools like Nmap. I don't know if any of you have used Nmap, a very common open source network scanner, right? Then again, like we call it a network scanner. It's not really meant to discover networks. It's to scan devices. And it has some plugins for detecting vulnerabilities. Now, what about a tool like, how we use GitHub security tools, right? Like CodeQL. That's the tool we use to detect vulnerabilities in what? In applications, right? Like if I write code that's unsafe and I try to check it in the Fleet repo, CodeQL is going to say like, hey, there looks like there's an SQL injection in the code that you just wrote, right? So the application security tools would fit definitely under application and identify, right? Like it's not protect, because identifying a vulnerability will let you fix it, might prevent you from deploying it. So one could argue that it does a little bit of protection, but it's really about identifying it. So CodeQL is another great example. Now, what about tools that scan containers, container images, right? I think that would probably fit under devices, right? Because when you scan a container image for vulnerabilities, you're doing the same thing we're doing with Fleet and laptops, right? So a container is not like a physical device you can touch like a laptop, but then we could say the same thing about virtual machines. So that's essentially how mapping things on the cyber defense matrix goes. And we could talk a lot more about different tools and look at the other columns, but we only have half an hour. So I'm just gonna clear the annotations right now. So how we'll use this at Fleet is to understand where our own product fits, right? As we add more features, do we start covering, more to the right? Are we starting to do more protect? Are we doing some detect? We'll see which products out there complement Fleet, right? Because we have APIs, we have integrations. And sometimes when we put this on a map, we can see like, oh, if someone is using Fleet, that really helps them in like this area. But if they're also using this other product, it can help them cover like networks, for example, right? Like we don't make network security tools. And then we'll make sense of buzzwords because there's way too many of them out there. And then as we build our own security portfolio internally, our own security program, we want to see if we have like too much coverage, right? In a small company, it's a little bit easier, but some of our customers that are really big companies have like 50 different security tools. And what can happen is you start putting them on the map and you realize, oh, we're spending 18 million a year on protection, but we're spending almost nothing on detection, right? We probably have a problem. We probably should rebalance because you could spend all the money you want on detection. Something's always going to go wrong, and you need to be able to respond to it, and then we need to detect it, respond to it, recover from it. And we'll probably come up with other ideas. So whenever we talk about, nice new open source tools that we discover, I think one thing that'd be nice is if whoever posts it to our Slack channel, try to put it on the map. Just say like, oh, I found, has anyone used this tool before? I think it fits under detect applications, for example. And as we use it more and more, it's just going to be like second nature kind of thing. All right, so my Chrome just froze for some reason. No, it did not freeze. I just suck at Zoom and I'm still annotating. All right. So more information about the Cyber Defense Matrix, you can hit the official website. There's a book. The book, by the way, I think there's a way to get a PDF of it through some link there. Just send me a message on Slack if you need that. There's a nice talk by Sunil on how to prioritize security controls in Amazon using the Cyber Defense Matrix. And then you have Evil the Plumbing. That's not an actual evil site. It's just a domain name I use when I do like conference talks and different things like that. And I have a spreadsheet linked to it from the top right to help bigger companies understand their budgets within the context of the Cyber Defense Matrix. So thanks a lot for joining. And if there's anyone from outside of Fleet watching this and you have questions, feel free to drop into the Fleet channel on the OS Query Slack. Everyone at Fleet, you definitely know where to find me.